Hello and a very warm welcome back to the garden. It is certainly boiling. There hasn't been any rain for a fair while and there's no rain in the forecast. And so just having to make sure that I'm keeping on top of getting these seedlings developing. This video is about crop rotation, why I think it's holding back a lot of gardeners, because in all honesty, I think there's a lot more important things to consider when growing food, and crop rotation isn't exactly suitable for our smaller spaces. So let me explain why. The main thing to understand about crop rotation is that it was developed for agricultural field scale models. And if you've got a allotment or a vegetable garden, it's not a field scale model of growing food. And so the reasons for crop rotation are really important. It's about making sure that there's enough nutrients in the soil, that you're not allowing a pest and disease build-up. And these are all very valid points. It's got popular over years in organic gardening, I understand why, but the practicality of actually applying it in our gardens, I think holds gardeners back more than the benefits that it offers, because it adds complexity, especially if your garden isn't a shape that's dividable into 4 exact areas. And I just think that it's maybe time to relook at crop rotation, and it's something that I haven't bothered with for the last 7 years. Now obviously crop rotation isn't used for things like perennials like this mint. I'm going to harvest a bunch of this for making a very powerful mint tea, maybe even turn it into a mint syrup, just cutting off the tops. So crop rotation is for the annual crops, and it's actually split usually into 4 different categories. So you've got legumes, which are your peas and beans. You've got your leaves, so those could be like brassicas or salads. Then you've got your fruiting crops like courgettes and tomatoes, and then you've got your roots like potatoes and beetroot. So the actual rotation is that leaves follow legumes, legumes follow roots, roots follow fruit, and fruit follow leaves. That is kind of the traditional one, the 4-year rotation. All it takes is a simple Google search about crop rotation to see that there's actually many different versions of crop rotation. There are sometimes a 3-year rotation, sometimes there are different plant group names, or you have alliums separate to roots. And there's also ones where it splits up into high feeders, low feeders, and kind of soil nutrient givers. And so it's really hard for a beginner gardener to look at all of this data and realize what is actually the best system for me. But this video is about why, for us gardeners, we don't need to use crop rotation as a system. So I'm going to explain why. So for smaller spaces, dedicating different areas of the garden for a specific plant group can be quite complex. One of the main things to remember is that we all have preferences. Maybe you just absolutely adore potatoes and you just want to grow half the garden as potatoes. And if you don't have much space, then that's something that you're going to do. You can't then try and build in crop rotation around that. It simply isn't practical enough. The other thing about small spaces is that you've got limited space, so you're trying to be as clever as possible with the given space to produce as much. Here I've got field beans, onions, garlic, peas. In front of the peas I'm going to plant a row of salad. All of these different things happening within about 3 or 4 square meters. And in this space I'm breaking the rules. I'm growing leaves with the legumes and roots with other legumes, and it isn't exactly crop rotation. Polytunnels is another growing space where crop rotation is quite hard, because for me I allocate about half of the space just to growing tomatoes, and so a 4-year rotation for growing tomatoes in a polytunnel is impossible. Now I'm going to just quickly talk through the number 1 reason why I think crop rotation is holding back or doesn't make sense, the context-wise, for a lot of gardeners, and it's the fact that we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that we get the most from our space. And for the majority of the annuals that we grow, we're actually growing 2 or 3 different crops in the same space over the year. So like when I harvest the potatoes, I might put in leeks or brassicas. And so then you ask yourself, where do you start that crop rotation from? Is it the leaves because of the brassicas, or is it because you had potatoes in to begin with? it starts to make it quite complicated. And so what we're doing as gardeners is that we're constantly adding diversity of plants to the soil. There is a natural rotation in a sense, just because we're planting in different crops over the year. And so in terms of the soil health and soil diversity and disease builds up, there isn't really that possibility, because there's always going to be something new growing in that space. And that's the other thing as well with, say, disease build-up. I very often will, plant potatoes elsewhere in the garden. It will just be a random bed every single year. It might not be the same bed, it might be the same bed, but also if I feel actually, yeah, I need to plant potatoes there 2 years in a row because I've got excited about field beans, then I'm not going to let that stop me from growing potatoes for 2 years in a row. I think one of the best examples of this is, I think about 9 years ago, Charles Dowding started a trial of just not doing any crop rotation, and his results have been fantastic. That is kind of all you need to see. It's working in this garden, it's worked really well for Charles Dowding, it's working really well for a lot of other gardeners. And I just get really passionate about this, because if there's any way that we can make growing food more simple, kind of less limiting, not really following the rule book, more enjoyable, more free, then hopefully more people can produce more food and have a little bit more joy. Of course, in the garden we're going to come across pest and disease issues. Some are a lot worse than others. Rust I don't really care about. A lot of pests like black fly I wouldn't care about. Things like clubroot for your brassicas, that is something that is a little bit more challenging. That is where I wouldn't perhaps recommend rotation, but if you've got clubroot in one part of your garden, then only grow brassicas in the other part. But that doesn't mean rotation, that just means choosing the most suitable site for that particular crop. Now, as well, if you enjoy crop rotation, if you enjoy the process of it, in terms of planning, as long as you don't want to change a single thing, it's quite easy, because every year you just rotate each block. But it's only possible if you have, say, a number of raised beds or square meters that are dividable by 4. But that's the thing as well about gardening. I'm trying to say that crop rotation isn't necessary, and I think for about 90% of gardeners it is holding them back. It's certainly, I'm speaking from experience, where it's held me back. But if it's something that you enjoy, absolutely do it, because that's what gardening is about. Gardening is an extension of our personality. I say this time and time again, and gardening, it's so important to do it in a way that feels best for us. And so if you still want to do crop rotation, go for it, because the most important thing is growing food. Whilst a vegetable garden right now feels kind of green, it's going to turn into an abundance of colour. That's a nice thing about kitchen gardens and allotments, is that they're, when you think about it compared to a field scale, they're very rich, diverse polyculture. This comfrey here is being amazing for all of the pollinators. What I would recommend you do is watch this video here. It's a garden tour video from summer last year. It will show you all of the polyculture, all of that diversity. That's a natural way of reducing pest and disease issues in the garden. I think far more effective for us growers than crop rotation.